All right, Judson, thank you so much for being on here. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So first off, I just want to get into a little bit of your background. You are the Director of Research over at the UMass Medical Center for Mindfulness. Can you talk a little bit about how you got there?
How did I get here?
Yeah.
Where do you want to start?
So I guess maybe your college career, what path led you to doing this research? And then, was there something that happened that directed you to mindfulness in particular?
Sure. So my college career was all about striving. I was a little bit type A. I went to Princeton, was a chemistry major, decided pretty late in the game that I wanted to go to medical school to do an MD Ph.D. program, and was doing a bunch of stuff trying to get a certificate in music performance, and so was very, very driven. And during that time, actually it was halfway into my senior year, I got engaged to be married, and then my fiance and I at the time, who were going to do this program together, broke up right before we started medical school together. So I was really suffering at the time.
There's a lot going on, it sounds like.
Yeah. So, for the first time, we weren't having good interactions in as we started medical school, and so I was having trouble sleeping actually, and somehow this Jon Kabat-Zinn book landed in my lap. I started meditating my first day of medical school, and quickly learned that during boring medical school lectures, I could pay attention to my breath.
So you're doing your own little extracurricular activities in mindfulness.
Yeah. I wouldn't exactly call it multitasking. But that's how it started deepening. And then, during my MD PhD program, I was studying molecular biology. I was very interested in seeing why we get sick when we're stressed, and so really looking to see how stress affected the immune system. And all the while, I just kept deepening my own practice and inquiry into how this mind worked, and even started going on longer retreats and whatnot. And by the time I finished school, it was about 8 years later, I decided to shift my entire research career from doing animal work to studying humans. And when I started doing my residency training at Yale, I really fell in love with treating people with addictions. And I think some of it was that they were speaking the same language as the Buddhist psychologists, who really had this understanding about how habits are formed and how they really drive our lives. And that's exactly what I was seeing with my patients. So I started doing clinical research, and then neurobiologic research, and then even developing app-based training for delivering mindfulness training and all that.
Cool. So it sounds like, you kind of had a circuitous route, but a lot of your passion for this stuff came rooted from your own life experiences.
Yes, the long and winding road.
So what kind of things are you working on now? You mentioned addiction. Could you talk a little bit about your work with addictions? And I know that you've done some work and research with helping people quitting smoking. Could you talk about how, what kind of findings have you had in that area?
Sure. We started by doing some work with alcohol and cocaine dependence, found that mindfulness training was as good as gold standard treatment in helping people not relapse to drug use, and it was actually better at helping them not get physiologically stressed out when we kind of gave them a little stress scenarios. We then turned to doing mindfulness training for smoking cessation and found that it was 5 times better than gold standard treatment, and at that time started learning mechanistically what was happening. So behaviorally, the mechanisms, the simplest way of thinking about this is a habit is formed through a trigger, a behavior, and a reward. So if we get stressed out, that's the trigger. The behavior is smoking a cigarette, and then the reward is feeling a little bit better. We can see how this habit gets formed over, multiple times a day over multiple years. And what we discovered was that helping people pay attention to that habit loop itself could help them step out of that automatic reaction where they'd automatically smoke to make themselves feel better, and could instead turn their awareness into their bodies, which is typically where they wanted to run away from, right, because it was unpleasant. Yeah. And not magically, but very, just as the Buddhist psychologists predicted, as we dive in and we notice that these are just physical sensations, we realize that these aren't, moral imperatives. These aren't, I had a patient who said, I feel like my head will explode if I don't smoke. And when we unpack what head exploding actually feels like, it's
not pleasant.
Sensation. Right. but those are bite-sized pieces that we can actually write out. And through that insight, people can learn to write out their cravings and quit smoking. And so we had published a couple of papers showing mechanistically how mindfulness training was helping people break the bad habit of smoking. And ironically, we started developing an app-based training for that, because people, when they go outside to smoke, they have their cigarette in one hand and they have their what in another? Their phone. Yes. So we can deliver the training right in the context where they learn these habits, which helps them unlearn them and also gives them the tools literally right at their fingertips, so they'll have them all the time. So we've got a couple of clinical trials running there. And this really funny thing happened, which was we had somebody testing out this smoking app that's called Craving to Quit, because we're moving from craving to quit. And they were saying, I'm actually changing my eating habits. And, my eyes kind of jumped out of my head, because a lot of people, they actually don't quit smoking because they're worried that they'll gain weight. Because you can imagine substituting some candy for cigarettes, and then you don't smoke, but you gain weight. Yep.
Or in my case, I have a close friend who his personal remedy was pizza rolls. He would
yes. Pizza rolls. So I'm not sure you can smoke those, but yes.
But you can certainly eat them all day long, 24/7.
So the pizza roll solution isn't a long-term solution, and we can see why, because it just provides a substitute strategy rather than something that dismantles the loop.
That's actually, you mentioned like your approach is sort of like looking at it mechanistically and breaking it down and replacing that loop. So what is it that's different from like someone who uses pizza rolls, for example, and where does your come in? Because I've heard before you want to just kind of replace the routine and then you have the same reward in place. How does mindfulness come in and replace the routine and then still give a person the same type of reward they might by smoking a cigarette?
Well, so great question. And the bottom line is it's actually a different reward. So if we walk through this, somebody gets stressed out, they have they're triggered to smoke, but they eat pizza rolls instead. And then they feel a little bit better because maybe they've gotten a little bit of a dopamine hit because the pizza releases dopamine in their brain. So dopamine, it's associated with like restlessness and excitement and things like this. So the different strategy using the same brain pathways is to teach people, so the stress is the trigger, and instead the behavior is to get curious about what stress feels like in our bodies. So what does curiosity itself feel like? Is it pleasant or unpleasant?
It's like a fun little exploration.
It is. And that fun little exploration provides its own intrinsic reward. Cool. So we don't have to look outside of ourselves for the pizza roll reward.
Right. So how can this be applied? So you're mentioning, obviously, you've worked with drug addiction or smoking. For the average person, right now you mentioned we have our phones with us 24/7. Someone who's looking to maybe wean themselves off of internet usage or like the other sort of I don't even know if I'd call them minor addictions, but the more like prevalent addictions that are in people's lives that are maybe a little bit more subtle. How can these same principles be applied to someone in that case?
I would say that we look for specific pain points. So, for example, stress eating is a pain point. So we're now, we've just launched this stress eating app called Eat Right Now, as in eat correctly in the present moment. And eventually we'll be able to roll out versions and probably a general addictions program that will be some version of Craving to Quit or something like that. But the idea is if we can help people identify what that pain point is, whether it's, distracting themselves on their phone when they're bored or, checking their Facebook feed or whatever, we can train them to pay attention to that behavior, notice, get curious about what that feels like, and then notice that joy of letting go. So I think, this is where, even before we developed the general addiction app, this is something that people can take into their everyday lives, where they can simply notice what that trigger is. That's the most important piece, because we're typically on autopilot at that point, and then just turn toward it with our awareness and get really curious. It's like we put on our Sherlock Holmes cap and say, oh, what does this feel like in my body?
Yeah.
Like you're saying, it's an exploration. And we can explore that without the need of an app. And then we can just notice what it feels like as these sensations come and go. And so we simply train people to note what their sensations are. So it might be tingling or tension or tightness or burning or heat or whatever. And every time we can note that, it helps us write out those waves.
So do you think a big part of that overcoming addiction or some kind of negative behavior is identifying, as you said, those pain points, like finding kind of those, leverage points in your life where you find the situation that's triggering those emotions or those sensations, and then being able to identify another way of approaching that or looking at it?
Yes. Yep. And identifying that other way of approaching it is simply the identification itself. So just getting curious. So there's really, there's nothing that we have to think about or nothing that we have to do except just get curious. That's it.
And so, I mean, I think a lot of attention is getting on because we use our phone so much and because, it's an internet age and everything's so connected, but also our attention is being pulled in 1,000 different directions. Do you feel like there is a risk there with all of that distraction and then everyday work stress? Because, obviously mindfulness has gotten a lot more attention now, and I think for good reason, but do you think that that's the correlation why it's becoming more mainstream is because of all the things pulling at our attention right now?
I think so. I think it's really a perfect storm with these phones at our fingertips because, we have a ready source of distraction. So anytime we're uncomfortable, you see this if you pull up to a stoplight at night, you look around and everybody's crotch is glowing blue. It's because they can't be with themselves.
Yeah, no, I've had friends tell me that like I hate driving without my phone. If I find I've forgotten my phone, I like immediately get a sense of discomfort because they know they're going to get to a stoplight. So they're already anticipating the discomfort they're going to have before they've even had it.
Hello, addiction.
So, I mean, it seems like, there's a lot of applications for the research that you're doing, not only with the people in more serious medical situations, but also for like the everyday person to be using them.
Yes, that's our hope is that, through these simple techniques that many people can benefit.
So aside from, you mentioned kind of like looking for those trigger points and then bringing mindfulness and getting curious and then sort of replacing that routine of that. Is there any other ways that you can think of for the average person to start applying some of the findings that you've had and into their life to get more benefit?
Well, one thing I would say is, and this has come from our neurobiologic understanding, we've identified a brain region that's part of what's called the default mode network that seems to get activated when we get caught up in our experience. So what I mean by getting caught up is basically when we get in our own way. So if you're, like, let's say that you and I were having an argument and suddenly we're both like, defending our position, that defense, tell me this, does it feel like a contraction or an expansion?
Yeah, it's a contraction.
Yeah. Just like anger or fear or anything like that. Now tell me what curiosity feels like. Is that contraction or expansion?
Yeah, it's the fun exploration. That's the opening.
Yeah, so that's the expansion. So literally it seems that this brain region gets activated when we're contracting, and it gets deactivated when we're getting out of our own way, when we're expanding. And if you think of that expansion going to infinity, that's when there's no me, there's no, it's like we've
that state of flow.
Right, that state of flow, exactly.
So speaking of that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so that's something that people can even explore in their own experience. In any one moment, when I'm getting caught up in a habit, am I contracting or am I expanding? And that can even be a tool that we can play with without all of the fancy neurofeedback devices that we've had to use.
Gotcha. And so one area that I take a similar approach with, the Panda Planner that I've created is the focus on gratitude. And gratitude seems to have a similar effect as far as expansion and contraction. When your mind gets into that way of looking at things that you're grateful for and appreciation, it seems to have that opening, expansive experience. I don't know if you've done any research or you have looked at this, but is there some sort of correlation between that appreciation and that curiosity? And these seem like similar areas that would be triggered in the brain.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So we were using our fMRI machine, and one of my colleagues at Yale developed this tool where we could give people feedback in real time. So we started testing different simple practices, And gratitude was one of the practices that we tested, because our hypothesis, just like yours, is that gratitude actually gives this expansive quality. So we actually, in real time, had people practice gratitude and measured this brain activity and saw that, in fact, it was causing a decrease in the brain activity, just like other types of meditation were. So I think gratitude, it helps us tap into this expanding, joyful quality as well. I think it's a wonderful practice.
Really cool. So, I mean, not to get too out there on you, but what do you think that's caused by? Do you think it seems like sort of we're getting more back to a natural state, and I think that the sort of stress levels that we have right now aren't natural, or they're just irregular states of being that we're not used to being in. And so, do you think that the reason, what do you think the reason is that our brains do open up because of gratitude or curiosity or those states?
Yeah, I think of it one way, and this is just a hypothesis, but I would say if you think of us going through life with this, where we think that we're driving the car, like I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And so in that sense, we can get in our own way when we get caught up in something, we take it personally when somebody cuts us off or whatever. So imagine this is it's like when I'm doing stuff, it's like we're driving the car with one foot on the gas and one on the brakes. And when we get out of our own way, it's like taking that foot off the brake so that our car can drive more efficiently. So our brain we're just allowing our brain to do what it does best. And at its extreme, like you mentioned earlier, this is flow, when we're completely out of our own way. So it seems that there's something where we get entangled and literally trip ourselves up.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, talking more about flow, how is it that we can tap into that? We've talked about a little bit about curiosity or gratitude, but also experiences that athletes are commonly achieve states of flow when they're being challenged and they have an activity that's immersive. What are some ways that we can tap into that feeling?
Yeah, so just picking up on that, I think it's interesting when you look at Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's definition of flow and how he describes that people can get into it. For a long time, I really pondered over this, but then it made a lot of sense. So he talks about picking an activity that's challenging, but that's not too challenging. So if we've mastered something, then our minds are more likely to wander, or, we're going to start thinking about something else or get in our own way if we're just doing it habitually. So that's too, the brain is not engaged enough, and then if it's too hard, we're going to get in our own way because we're going to say, oh, I can't do this. So what he suggests is trying to find this sweet spot where there's enough engagement where we don't have time to be thinking about it, we just have to be doing it. That sweet spot is there, and I think that's one way to get into flow. He also described that meditation was another way, because a lot of meditative practices are geared toward helping us realize that it isn't something that I'm the captain of the ship. The ship's actually happening, and I'm sitting in the back thinking that I'm doing something. Yeah. So if we just get out of the way, we can just flow along with life, and so we can tap into that at any time. I love to do it when mountain biking. Nature is a great way for us to get out of our own way.
Have you looked into, is there any kind of carryover between people who have a mindfulness practice and achieving flow more easily in their unrelated life? So not just achieving flow while meditating, but also in their day-to-day life?
In my own personal experience, I would say absolutely. So yes, because the more we can bring that off the cushion into getting out of our own way in our daily life, the more that we realize we can tap into this all the time. So my experience is yes, and we've actually seen experienced meditators drop into flow while we're scanning their brains, and so in real time we get a snapshot of that. So I haven't seen that with novice meditators. So I would say there's definitely, anecdotally, I would say that's absolutely the case, and that's what we hear reports of as well.
Gotcha. So it seems like even your state of being almost becomes habitual as well.
Yes, and I would say the state of getting out of our own way, because it's so much more pleasant not to be in there thinking,
Right.
I'm right, or I can't believe that jerk, or whatever. It's just like, okay, here's what's happening. Let's deal with it.
Yeah, and I've seen with the fMRI testing around people who are playing where that area of like self-monitoring actually goes down, and you're able to achieve that flow when you're just having fun a lot easier as well.
Yes. There have been studies showing with jazz improv, I think with freestyle rap, with different ways where people are just completely out of their own way, that this self-referential brain network does get quiet.
So then that leads very well into like routines as far as building your own habits so that they become habitual and doing that consciously. What are some recommendations on how to incorporate some of these principles into a morning routine so that these can become your normal day-to-day experience?
So the first thing I would say is to find something that we do habitually and then just get really curious. So the curiosity is key here. And the more we can tap into curiosity all the time, the more that becomes our habit, where we're literally starting to, get out of our own way. So we can even, if we walk into the kitchen, we can just get, if there are plants in there, or if there's a window, we can look out the side of the window and just get curious about, oh, look at the color of the leaves on the tree, or even look at the texture on the countertop. There are lots of
Right.
ways that we can just notice these everyday things that we take for granted, and just let our curiosity rip and be like, oh wow, look at that. Like, in a way that's not, we can't force the curiosity, but we can certainly let ourselves trip into it.
So like things like, I mean, obviously like meditation can be one that can be part of a morning routine, but I think the things that you're talking about are great and applicable throughout your entire day-to-day experience. So like from the time you wake up until you go to
Yes.
sleep, that curiosity can become a habit or like a touchstone. Cool. So do you follow a morning routine yourself?
I get up in the morning. One of the routines that I love is that my wife and I meditate together in the morning, and we'll often do a little bit of yoga together before we sit. And so that's one routine that I find very enjoyable.
I found actually the carryover between a meditation practice and then yoga. So I started the other way around. I was first introduced to yoga, and I only looked at it, I had like a very much an athletic and competitive background, so I looked at yoga as like a thing to be the best at. And so, I was in there like trying to have the best poses and like trying to like do a really good job. And it wasn't until later when I was introduced to meditation and started to really have a decent practice and get a little bit deeper that I was able to have that carryover that we talked about earlier into my yoga practice, where it became a similar mindful practice, but
Right.
before that it was just a competitive, might as well have been like a Zumba class. Cool. So, and why is the yoga an important part of your morning routine? The meditation we've gone into, but what kind of benefits do you find from doing yoga in the morning with your wife?
Well, it's a simple practice of mindful movement. So we could do yoga either competitively, like you were joking about, or we could also do it habitually, where we're just going through the motions. Or we can drop in and get really curious. Oh, what does my body feel like right now? Oh, is there some preconceived notion that I have about how far I can stretch or whether I can hold this position? So in one sense, it becomes meditation and movement. And in another, very pragmatically, it's a great way to give the body some movement and some stretching as a way to prepare the body to sit for meditation. And that's where, the corpse pose comes at the end of the yoga routine, because the body is now settled, and then it's a good condition that's created so that the mind can practice.
Cool. So are there any new areas either that you're doing research or that you see out there in the field, just different areas that you're really excited about right now?
Well, I would say we're really interested in seeing how we can kind of use technology for good rather than evil. So we are.
Yeah, me too.
It looks like we're just going to get some funding from the NIH to study the neurobiology of how our app-based training actually helps people change habits. And as a second phase of that study, we're going to pair the app-based training with neurofeedback, so we can give people feedback from their brains in real time while they're starting to learn these practices. And we're really interested to see if this type of feedback helps them kind of learn what it feels like to get caught up and what it feels like to let go in a way that helps them learn these practices, let's just say more accurately.
That's awesome. I'm actually super excited to see like we talked about earlier, the sort of like broad applications of this technology and how it can be used for everyone, because I think the need is never been higher, and I'm excited to see what kind of stuff you guys are going to put out.
Great.
Cool. Thanks so much, Judson. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.